He slammed $20 on the table and said, "She's coming with me." The entire room went silent. Clara Bennett stood frozen, her wrists still shaking, staring at the stranger who just bought her future with a month's worth of trail wages, and she didn't even know his name. Was he saving her, or just buying himself a different kind of trouble? If you believe one act of courage can rewrite a life, hit subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The night it happened, nobody in Silver Creek expected it. Not the bartender who had wiped down that same counter 1,000 times and seen 1,000 things he wished he hadn't. Not the men slumped over their drinks, half listening with the lazy attention of people who had long since decided that other people's suffering wasn't their problem, and certainly not Clara Bennett. She stood near the back wall of Grady's trading post. Shoulders pulled in arms, crossed over her chest, like she was trying to take up as little space in the world as possible. She had gotten good at that over the years, making herself small, making herself invisible, disappearing into the edges of rooms so nobody had to decide whether to acknowledge her. She had learned the hard way that being noticed usually meant something bad was coming, and tonight something bad had already arrived. His name was Frank Dobbs, and he was a man built entirely out of desperation and bad decisions. He stood at the counter with his jaw set and his eyes red from either drink or sleeplessness. Clara could never tell the difference with men like Frank, and he was talking too loud, the way men do when they want everyone in the room to hear them, but also want to pretend they're having a private conversation. "She's staying here until I get what I'm owed," Frank said, slapping his palm on the counter. "That's all I'm saying. I took her in when she had nothing. Fed her, housed her, kept her alive through 2 winters. That ain't charity. That's a debt." The bartender, old Pete Grady himself, kept his eyes on the glass he was drying. He didn't say anything. Pete had survived 40 years on the frontier by learning exactly which conversations to stay out of. "Don't see how that's your problem, Pete," said one of the men at the bar. A heavy-set cattle buyer named Amos who visited Silver Creek twice a year. He said it like a joke, then went back to his drink. A few people chuckled. Clara kept her eyes on the floor. She had heard herself described as a debt before. As a burden. As a liability. As something Frank had to deal with, like a fence that needed mending, or a horse that wouldn't cooperate. She had heard her own name spoken in the same tone people used when they talked about bad weather or broken equipment. She had never once heard herself described the way she deserved. But that was the world she lived in. Or at least the world she had lived in until that night. Frank turned around and looked at her directly. Then the way you look at something you're trying to sell and aren't entirely sure anyone will want to buy. $20, he said. "That's what I'm asking. $20, and she walks out of here with whoever's got the coin. Otherwise, she works off what she owes me right here." The room went very quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of an evening winding down. The uncomfortable quiet of people deciding whether to look or look away. Most of them looked away. Clara's throat tightened. She felt the familiar cold that always came when she realized she had no options. Not the cold of winter, which at least you could fight with a blanket and a fire. The cold of being completely, utterly at the mercy of someone else's decision. She had been here before. Not in this exact room, not with Frank specifically, but in this exact moment. The moment where her future was being decided by people who had never once bothered to ask her name. $20. That was what the last 5 years of her life were worth, apparently. She pressed her back against the wall and waited. And that was when the door opened. Thomas Walker didn't make a dramatic entrance. He wasn't that kind of man. He came in the way he always came into rooms, slowly, deliberately ducking slightly under the doorframe. Because at 6 feet and 3 inches, he had spent a lifetime ducking under doorframes, and he was already looking toward the bar before he registered that something was wrong. Then he stopped. He had the instincts of a man who had spent decades reading situations the way other people read newspapers. Fast. Accurately, without needing to be told what anything meant. He read this one in about 4 seconds. Frank Dobbs. The counter. The money Frank clearly didn't have. The silence of 30 people pretending they weren't watching. And Clara pressed against the back wall with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for the worst thing to happen, and has finally accepted that it's here. Thomas had seen a lot of things in his 38 years. He had seen cattlemen lose everything in a single bad winter. He had seen good men make terrible choices and terrible men get everything they wanted. He had seen kindness go unrewarded and cruelty go unpunished so many times that he had come to a working understanding that the world was not organized around fairness. He had made his peace with that, or he thought he had. He walked to the counter and stood beside Frank Dobbs, and he said quietly, "What's the 20 for?" Frank turned and looked up at him. Everyone always had to look up at Thomas with the evaluating expression of a man trying to figure out if this newcomer was a problem or an opportunity. "Man's looking to collect a debt," Amos offered from down the bar helpfully. "Woman there owes him for room and board. 5 years of it." Thomas didn't look at Amos. He looked at Frank. "She agreed to this?" Thomas asked. His voice was level, conversational. The voice of a man asking a question he already knew the answer to. Frank bristled. "Ain't about agreeing. It's about what's owed." "In my experience," Thomas said, still perfectly calm, "when a person agrees to something, there's no need to bring them to a public room and announce a price." Frank's face went red. "Now listen here." "I'm listening," Thomas said. "I'm just not hearing anything that tells me this woman owes you a single thing." The room had gone completely still. Pete Grady set down his glass very carefully. Frank Dobbs opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. He wasn't used to being spoken to that way, especially not in public, especially not by someone a full head taller than him, with the kind of stillness that experienced men recognized as dangerous. "You got no business in this," Frank said finally. "Unless you're interested in covering the debt." Thomas Walker reached into his coat. He pulled out his wallet. He counted out $20, slowly, deliberately, each bill placed on the counter with the finality of a man who has made up his mind and is not interested in discussion, and he pushed the money toward Frank without a word. The room exhaled. Frank stared at the money like he wasn't sure whether to take it or argue. He took it. Thomas turned around and looked at Clara for the first time. She was staring at him with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life. Not gratitude, not relief, but something more complicated and more painful than either of those things. A kind of wondering horror. Like she had just watched one cage door open and was waiting to find out what the new cage looked like. "You paid $20 for me?" she asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of that room, it carried. Thomas held her gaze. "I paid $20, he said carefully, "so that man over there would stop talking about your value like he had any idea what it was." Clara didn't move. "That doesn't change what it is," she said. "No," Thomas agreed. "It doesn't. Which is why right now I'm going to walk out that door. And you can do whatever you want. Go wherever you want. I'm not asking you for anything, and I'm not expecting anything back." He picked up his hat from the counter. "But if you want to come," he said, "I've got a ranch up in the mountain pass. Got a spare room, a warm stove, and enough work to keep a person busy if they want to be busy. And I swear on whatever you care about that nobody up there is going to put a price on you." He put his hat on. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and didn't look back. "I'll be at the post rail for about 5 minutes, he said. "After that, I'm riding home." And he walked out.
Chandler.
Clara stood very still for a long moment. The men at the bar slowly turned back to their drinks. Amos made a comment under his breath that she didn't catch. Pete Grady went back to drying glasses. Frank Dobbs pocketed the money and left without looking at her. Just like that, she was nobody's debt anymore. She was just a woman standing in a room where nobody particularly wanted her, which she thought, with a hollow kind of clarity, wasn't that different from most nights. She thought about the spare room. She thought about the warm stove. She thought about the way Thomas Walker had said, "You can do whatever you want." Not as a dismissal, not as indifference, but like he genuinely meant it. Like the option was real, and the choice was hers, and he had no stake in which way it went. She couldn't remember the last time someone had said something like that to her. She picked up the small cloth bag that held everything she owned. She walked to the door. She looked out into the cold Montana night. Thomas was where he said he'd be, adjusting the saddle on a big gray horse, not looking toward the trading post. Not waiting with any visible expectation. Just doing what needed to be done the way she would come to understand he did everything. She walked out to the post rail. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed, not looking up from the saddle. "I don't trust you." "Fair enough. And I'm not—" She stopped. She wasn't sure how to say what she needed to say. "I'm not what people say I am. Whatever you heard about me in there or around town, I need you to know that before anything else." Thomas finished with the saddle and turned to look at her. "I didn't hear anything about you in there," he said. "I heard a man trying to sell something that wasn't his to sell." Clara stared at him. "Those are two different things," he said. She stood there in this cold for a long moment. Then she said, "I need to know the rules. If I come with you, I need to know exactly what you expect." Thomas nodded like this was a reasonable and intelligent thing to ask. "Room and board," he said. "In exchange for help around the ranch, whatever you're able to do. If something doesn't suit you, you say so. If you want to leave at any point, you leave. There's a town 15 miles south of my place with a general store and a post office, and people who don't know either of us. That's it. That's it." Clara looked at him for a long time. She was trying to find the catch, the hidden condition, the thing that was really being asked that hadn't been said yet. She didn't find it, which frightened her more than finding it would have. "All right," she said finally. And that was how Clara Bennett rode up into the mountains with a stranger. Not because she trusted him, but because standing still had stopped being an option. The ride up to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours. Thomas didn't try to fill the silence with conversation, and Clara was grateful for that. She had spent years around men who filled silence with noise because they were uncomfortable with it, who talked constantly without saying anything, who asked questions they didn't actually want answered. Thomas Walker rode with the quiet of a man who had long since made peace with his own company. Clara spent most of the ride studying the back of his head and trying to construct a theory about who he was. He was big. She had registered that immediately, the kind of physical presence that changes the air in a room. But he didn't carry himself like men who use their size as a threat. He moved carefully, deliberately, like someone who was always aware of how much space he took up and was consciously trying to take up less. His clothes were worn but clean. His horse was well cared for. His saddle was old but well maintained. These were the details of a man who paid attention to things, who understood that the difference between good and broken was usually just consistent maintenance. She filed all of this away without drawing any conclusions. She had learned over the years that first impressions were the most dangerous thing in the world. The most dangerous men she had ever known had given wonderful first impressions. She would watch. She would wait. And she would not, under any circumstances, let herself believe that anything was safe until she had evidence. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked somewhere around the halfway point of the ride. Not because she particularly wanted to know, but because she had decided that gathering information was smarter than silence. 12 years, Thomas said. Bought it from a man named Garrett who decided Montana winters weren't for him after the second one. And before that, Army. Then cattle drives. Then a few years of work I'm not particularly proud of. He said it without embarrassment or self-pity, just fact. Then I decided I wanted something that was mine. And you live alone up there? Yes. For 12 years. A pause. For the last 7. She let that sit. There was something in how he said the last 7, a precision that indicated the first 5 years had been different, that someone or something had been there and then wasn't anymore. She didn't ask. She had her own silences she didn't want pressed on. They rode the rest of the way without talking. The ranch was not what Clara had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected exactly. Some rough, barely functional arrangement of boards and determination, maybe. The kind of place a lone man builds when he doesn't much care about comfort. But the house was solid, well built. The kind of construction that meant someone had cared once about how it would hold up over time. There was a barn off to the left, a well-maintained fence line she could see in the dark, a woodpile stacked with the neat efficiency of someone who understood that winter didn't negotiate. And inside was the first real warmth she had felt in months. Not just the warmth of the fire which Thomas built up quickly and without comment, but the warmth of a house that had been lived in by people who cared about it. There were curtains on the windows, a braided rug on the floor worn thin in the middle from years of foot traffic, a shelf of books, real books, not just almanacs and supply catalogs along the far wall. Someone had made this into a home. And then someone had left. She didn't ask. Thomas showed her the spare room, small, simple, with a narrow bed and a hook on the wall for hanging things. And he said, "There's water in the pitcher, extra blankets in the chest. Wood stove heats up fast if you load it right. I'll show you in the morning." "Thank you," she said. He nodded and turned to leave. "Mr. Walker." He stopped. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you do what you did tonight?" "The truth." He was quiet for a moment. "Because nobody else was going to," he said. "That's not a reason. Plenty of things happen that nobody stops." He turned back to look at her. "Because I know what it looks like," he said quietly, "when a person is waiting to find out what their life is going to do to them next. And I've been that person. And I know that sometimes the difference between surviving and not surviving is whether one person decides they give a damn." He said it simply without drama. "That's the truth," he added. "Good night, Miss Bennett." He walked out and closed the door behind him. Clara sat on the edge of the narrow bed. She sat there for a long time. She was trying to figure out how to process a person like Thomas Walker. Her entire experience of the world had taught her that people wanted things. They were always wanting things. And the more generously they offered something, the more carefully hidden the wanting usually was. But Thomas had walked out of that trading post and told her to come or not come, her choice. And then he had spent 2 hours riding in silence beside her, without once trying to remind her that she owed him something. And now he had told her the truth. Not a flattering truth. Not a self-aggrandizing truth. Just, I know what it looks like when a person is waiting for what comes next. And sometimes one person giving a damn makes the difference. Clara lay back on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. She did not sleep for a long time. But for the first time in years, she was not lying awake afraid. She was lying awake thinking. That was different. That was something. Tank. Morning came in cold and sharp and full of work. Clara had always been a person who needed something to do. Idleness had never suited her. When there was no work, her mind turned inward, and her mind was not always a kind place to spend time. She was up before Thomas, which surprised her. She had half expected to wake to the sounds of a household already in motion, the way she had in most places. She'd lived always a step behind someone else's rhythm. But the house was quiet, and the fire had burned down to coals, and the world outside was still the dark blue of very early morning. She rebuilt the fire, she found coffee and made it. She was standing at the window when Thomas came through the kitchen, and she could tell by the way he stopped that he had not expected to find her up. "Coffee's on," she said. He looked at the stove, then at her. "Thank you," he said. They drank coffee together in silence, standing on opposite sides of the kitchen, and there was something almost companionable about it. Two people who didn't know each other, but had both made the same practical decision to meet the morning head-on rather than wait for it. Then Thomas put on his coat and his hat and said, "I'm going to show you the property, so you know where things are and what's what, and after that it's your time to do with as you please." "I'd rather be useful," she said. He looked at her steadily. All right. And so the day began. He showed her the barn first. The 4 horses, the 2 milk cows, the arrangement of feed and tools and equipment. He explained the rhythm of the ranch with the efficiency of a man who had thought carefully about what needed explaining and was not inclined to over-explain. She asked smart questions. She could tell that registered with him, not because he made a show of it, but because something in his posture shifted some small increment of guardedness releasing. She noticed these things about people. She had always been good at it. You learned to read rooms carefully when rooms were not usually safe places for you. You know horses, he said at one point. It wasn't a question. I grew up with them, she said. What happened? She looked at him sideways. A lot of things. None of which I'm ready to explain yet. He nodded like yet was a perfectly acceptable timeline. That's fair, he said, and moved on. The day was the first of many. Each one built on the last in small, incremental ways that Clara began to recognize as the architecture of a life, rather than just the passage of time. She fell into the work of the ranch naturally, the way you fall into something you have always known how to do but haven't had occasion to do in a while. There was a steadiness to it that suited her. The horses needed feeding, whether the world made sense or not. The wood needed splitting, whether she was afraid or confident. The rhythms of the ranch didn't care about her past. That was, she realized, one of the most healing things about it. The work didn't know who she had been. It only knew what she was doing right now. Thomas worked alongside her without making her feel supervised, which was a rarer skill than most people understood. He had a way of being nearby without crowding, of noticing things without commenting on them unless comment was actually needed, of offering help in the form of doing rather than asking, would you like help with that, in a way that required her to admit weakness. By the end of the first week, she had started to relax. Not completely, not by a long stretch, but the tight, constant vigilance she carried everywhere, the readiness to spot the trick, the catch, the thing that had been hidden had begun to ease just slightly at the edges. She caught herself on the 8th morning humming while she worked. She stopped immediately startled, like someone who had forgotten they were capable of making music. Thomas was across the barn, and he either didn't notice or pretended not to. She was grateful for that, too. But Silver Creek had a long memory, and some people in Silver Creek had a particular investment in certain stories staying the way they were. The trouble started on a Tuesday when Clara rode into town for the first time since that night at Grady's trading post. Thomas had asked if she needed anything from the general store, and she had said she would go herself. She hadn't said it as a test exactly, but it was something she needed to do. She needed to know she could still walk into a town and handle whatever she found there. She found Edna Marsh. Edna was the wife of the town's largest landowner, a woman who had appointed herself the moral custodian of Silver Creek sometime around 1872 and had never stepped down. She was standing outside the general store with 2 other women when Clara rode up, and the particular quality of the silence that fell was one Clara knew very well. The silence of people who have already been talking about you and have been caught. Clara Bennett, Edna said. Not a greeting. An announcement. Mrs. Marsh, Clara said, and tied her horse. I heard you're up at the Walker place now. Edna said, heard the way people say it when they mean everyone is talking about this, and we have opinions. Quite a situation. It's work, Clara said simply. Good morning. She went to walk past. He paid for you, Edna said to her back. Clara stopped. She didn't turn around. Not yet. $20, Edna continued. Frank Dobbs told it to half the town. Said Thomas Walker walked in and bought that woman like she was a sack of flour. Clara turned around slowly. She had 2 options in this moment. She had been here before. 2 options: retreat back into smallness or say the thing that needed to be said. Mr. Walker, she said clearly, loudly enough for the street, paid Frank Dobbs $20 to end a conversation that Frank Dobbs never should have started. He didn't buy anything. He stopped something. Edna stared at her. And whoever Frank Dobbs told his version of that story to, Clara added, got Frank Dobbs's version, which is worth exactly what you'd expect from a man who put a price tag on another person. She went into the store. Her hands were shaking the entire time she made her purchases. But her voice had not shaken. Not once. She didn't tell Thomas about it when she got back. She went to the barn, put her horse up, and then stood there for a while, steadying herself against the solid reality of the animal's warmth. She had said the right thing. She knew she had. She had said the true thing. But she had also spent so many years learning to say nothing, that saying something left her feeling raw and exposed in a way she didn't entirely know how to manage. Clara. She turned. Thomas was leaning in the barn doorway. He had a look on his face she was beginning to recognize attentive without being intrusive, asking a question with his presence that he wasn't going to push with words. I ran into Edna Marsh, she said. He absorbed this. How'd that go? I said what needed saying. He looked at her for a moment. You all right? She considered the question seriously the way it deserved. I think so, she said. I'm not used to it. Saying things. Looks like you're getting used to it, he said, and he went back to work. Clara stood there a moment longer, then she followed. It was around the third week when the question first came up, not directly, but in the way that real questions always arrive sideways and unexpectedly dressed up as something else. They were at the kitchen table after supper, Thomas going over the ranch's account books, Clara mending a fence line harness that had frayed in the week's work. The fire was low and comfortable, the kind of evening that had stopped feeling strange and started feeling terrifyingly like something she could get used to. You had a family, she said. Not a question. A statement of the shape she had been slowly tracing from the evidence around her. Thomas kept his eyes on the account book for a moment. Yes, he said. The curtains, she said. The rug. The way the kitchen is set up, it's not how a man alone sets up a kitchen. There's care in it. The kind of care that comes from someone who was going to be here a long time. He was quiet. I'm sorry, she said. I shouldn't have. Wife and a son, he said. Fever, 7 years ago, 3 weeks apart. The fire popped. Clara set down the harness. I'm very sorry, she said. She said it simply without the excess of consolation that people usually draped over grief, like it could cover the shape of it. He looked up at her then. Thank you, he said. And she could tell he meant it, not the automatic thank you that people give to sympathy, but genuine gratitude for the way she had said it. The directness of it. I lost a daughter, she said, quietly, not looking at him, looking at the harness in her hands. 3 years ago. She was 2 years old. And that was the beginning of when everything else went wrong. The room was very still. Her father, he asked, gone before she was born. And I don't say that to make him a villain because the story is more complicated than that. But I was alone. And being alone with a baby when you have no money and no family and no one who considers you worth helping. She stopped. It changes you, she said. Surviving changes you. Sometimes it changes you in ways you're not proud of. And then people see what you became trying to survive, and they decide that's what you always were. Thomas set the account book down. He didn't say anything for a long moment. I know what that's like, he said finally. Being judged by who you became instead of why you became it. Clara looked at him. For the first time since she had come to the mountain ranch, she let herself actually look at him. Not as someone she was monitoring for danger. Not as a situation she was trying to read and manage, but as a person. He looked back. I'm not going anywhere, she said, surprised by herself. I just want you to know that. I know I said I could leave whenever, but I'm not going anywhere. Thomas nodded. Good, he said. He picked up the account book again. She picked up the harness. and the evening continued quiet and warm in a house that was slowly remembering what it was like to have two people in it. The first real test came without warning. It always does. It was a Friday morning barely 2 weeks before Christmas, and a rider came up the mountain pass at a clip that said news before the man even spoke. Clara was in the yard when he arrived, and she recognized him, one of the hands from the Double M spread south of town, a young man named Riley, who had always been friendly enough when she'd crossed his path before. He looked surprised to see her. He looked more than surprised. He looked like he'd arrived with a story he was now recalculating on the fly. "Mr. Walker in?" he asked. "I'll get him," she said. She went to the barn where Thomas was working on a broken wheel axle and said simply, "Rider from the Double M. Looks like he has something important to say." Thomas came out, wiped his hands, spoke to Riley. Clara went back to her own work but didn't go far. She heard the words Frank Dobbs and trouble and told people things. She stopped walking. She didn't turn around. She waited. Riley rode back down the mountain, and Thomas walked toward her with the steady pace of a man who has received bad news and is deciding how to handle it before he arrives. "What did Frank say?" Clara asked before Thomas could speak. Thomas looked at her steadily. "He's been telling people that you're not, that the arrangement up here isn't what I said it was." He said it carefully, choosing each word. "That I bought you, and that you're not here of your free choice, and that anyone who tells it otherwise is covering for me." Clara went very still. "He's saying that to make himself look better," she said. "Yes, because if people believe he sold something, that's one kind of story. But if people believe you bought something, that's a different kind of story. And either way, I'm the one who comes out as a thing instead of a person." Thomas held her gaze. "That's exactly right. What are you going to do about it?" He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something that wasn't quite anger, but was built from the same materials. "That depends," he said, "on what you want to do about it." She stared at him. "It's your name," he said. "It's your life. I've got opinions about what should happen, but this isn't my story to tell." Clara stood there in the cold mountain air and felt something shift in her chest. Not the cold anymore. Something else. Something that felt dangerously like the beginning of trust. "I want to tell it myself," she said. "Then we'll go to town," he said. "When you're ready." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm ready now," she said. And the day that had started as a quiet Friday morning on a mountain ranch became something else entirely. It became the day Clara Bennett stopped waiting for the world to decide her story and started deciding it herself. And the day that had started as a quiet Friday morning on a mountain ranch became the day Clara Bennett stopped waiting for the world to decide her story and started deciding it herself. She rode into Silver Creek beside Thomas Walker with her back straight and her hands steady, which was not how she felt on the inside, but which was, she had decided, the only way she was willing to arrive. The inside could shake all it wanted. The outside was done shaking. Thomas said nothing on the ride down. He understood she was starting to realize the difference between support and noise. He didn't offer her encouragement or advice or the particular brand of reassurance that men often gave women before difficult situations, the kind that was really about making themselves feel better for having said something useful. He just rode beside her, present, solid, available without being required. She had not had that before. She wasn't sure what to do with it other than be grateful for it quietly. Silver Creek on a Friday morning was never empty. The general store had its usual cluster of people. The post office had its line. Outside the feed merchant, two men were loading grain into a wagon and talking with the comfortable loudness of people who had no particular reason to keep their voices down. One of them was Frank Dobbs. Clara saw him before he saw her, which gave her exactly 3 seconds of advantage. 3 seconds to decide whether to slow down, whether to cross to the other side, whether to find a reason to be somewhere else when the moment arrived. She did not slow down. Frank looked up when he heard the horses. His face went through several expressions very quickly. Surprise? calculation. Then a particular kind of defiance that Clara recognized as the expression of a man who has been saying things he knows aren't entirely true and has just been caught mid-sentence. The other man with him, she didn't know him. Someone from out of the area looked between Frank and the two approaching riders with the expression of someone who has just realized they are adjacent to something uncomfortable. "Frank," Thomas said. Just that, just his name, in the tone of a man who has something to say and is taking his time getting to it. Frank straightened up. "Walker." "Heard you've been talking," Thomas said. "Free country," Frank said, but his jaw had gone tight. "It is," Thomas agreed. "And Clara here is a free person. I want to make sure you understand that. Because the story you've been telling doesn't seem to reflect that." Frank looked at Clara then. There was something in his look that she had seen before, the look of a man trying to find the version of her that matched the story he'd been telling. The version that was lesser, that was uncertain, that would look away. She did not look away. "I never said anything that wasn't true," Frank said. "You said he bought me," Clara said clearly. Her voice was calm. She was surprised by how calm it was. "You've been telling people that Thomas Walker bought me like property, and I'm here to tell you in front of whoever wants to hear it that what happened that night was that a man who owed me nothing decided to end a situation that you created. He doesn't own me. Nobody owns me. And if you keep saying otherwise, you're going to have to explain to this town why you were trying to sell another person in the first place." The grain loading had stopped. The two men with the wagon were listening with the focused attention of people who understood they were witnessing something significant. Frank's face had gone from defiant to something she could only describe as cornered. "I was collecting what was owed," he said. "But it came out smaller than before." "You were doing no such thing," Clara said. "I worked for my room and board every single day I was in your house. I cooked and I cleaned and I kept that place running, and you know it. If there was a debt between us, Frank Dobbs, it ran the other direction." Frank opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Thomas with the expression of a man hoping for a lifeline. Thomas gave him nothing. "I'd suggest," Thomas said quietly, "that the stories you've been telling stop here. Not for my sake. Not even for Clara's particularly. But because the truth has a way of coming out, and the further you get from it, the worse the landing." Frank looked at the ground. Then he looked back up. And for just a moment, one brief, unguarded moment, Clara saw something in his face that wasn't anger or defiance or calculation. Something that looked almost like shame. "Fine," Frank said. Low, barely audible. He picked up the grain sack he'd dropped and went back to loading the wagon. And that was it. Not an apology. Not a reckoning. Not the dramatic collapse of everything that had been built against her. Just fine. Clara had expected to feel more when this moment arrived. She had imagined it in the abstract as something larger, some significant reversal, some moment where the scales balanced visibly, and everyone could see that they'd been wrong about her. What she actually felt was something quieter, and she thought truer. She felt like a person who had said the thing that needed saying, and that it turned out was enough. Thomas touched the brim of his hat to Frank, to the men with the wagon, to no one in particular, and they rode on. When they were past the feed merchant and heading toward the general store, Thomas said without looking at her, "You didn't need me there." "No," she said. "But I'm glad you let me come." She glanced at him. He was looking straight ahead. "So am I," she said. They left it there, but Clara carried it with her for the rest of the day. Turning it over in her mind, the way you turn over something unexpected you've found, trying to understand what it is, where it came from, why it feels so different from everything you've held before. He was glad she let him come, not glad he'd been there to protect her, not glad he'd been there to speak for her, glad she had let him come, like his presence was a thing she'd given him rather than a service he'd rendered. She had never been looked at that way. Like her choice mattered. Like her permission was something worth being grateful for. It unsettled her in a way she didn't have words for yet. But unsettled, she was beginning to understand, was not the same as afraid. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Clara's life, because they were ordinary. Achingly, bewilderingly ordinary. She woke up in the same room every morning. She did the same work. She ate meals at the same table. She learned the names of the horses and the particular complaints of the older milk cow, and the way Thomas took his coffee, no sugar too hot for any reasonable person straight from the fire. And none of these things were dramatic or significant, but their ordinariness felt to Clara like the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to her. She had never had ordinary before. She hadn't known what she was missing. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the confrontation with Frank, she was in the barn working through a broken bridle, when Thomas came in with a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Not the careful, contained expression he usually wore. Something more open, more uncertain. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that whatever you answer, nothing changes." Clara set down the bridle. "All right," she said. He seemed to be choosing his words with unusual care. "Are you happy here?" She stared at him. "I don't mean—" He stopped, tried again. "I'm not asking to hear a particular answer. I'm asking because I want to know. Because if there's something missing or something not right or something you need that you haven't said—" "Thomas," she said. He stopped. "I haven't been happy in so long," she said carefully, "that I'm not entirely sure I'm using the word correctly. But I wake up in the morning and I know what I'm doing that day, and I do it. And at the end of the day, I feel like I've done something that mattered. And I eat supper, and I sleep, and I'm not afraid." She paused. "I don't know if that's happiness, but whatever it is, I haven't had it before." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." He picked up the other end of the bridle and started helping her with it. They worked side by side in silence, but it was a different silence than the one from that first cold night ride up the mountain. That silence had been the silence of two people who didn't know each other. This silence was the silence of two people who did not completely not, without reservation. But enough. Enough to be in the same space without pretense. Enough to know that the quiet was shared rather than separate. Clara recognized it only later. It was the silence of something beginning. It was around that time that she started noticing things about Thomas she had been too careful to notice before. The way he moved through the ranch with a kind of absorbed attention like the work itself was thinking. The way he laughed rarely, but when he did, it came from somewhere genuine, not the performed laugh of a man trying to seem easygoing. The way he talked to the horses in the quiet voice of someone who believes that all creatures deserve to be addressed with respect. The way he never once, in all the weeks she had been there, made her feel like a burden or a debt or a problem to be managed. She had cataloged so many things about him stored in the meticulous internal ledger she kept for people she didn't yet trust that she had to stop one evening and ask herself an honest question. When had she stopped not trusting him? She couldn't identify the moment. It had happened gradually, the way real things happen, not in a dramatic instant of revelation, but in the accumulation of small evidences. The coffee in the morning, the way he'd stood beside her outside Grady's trading post and meant it when he said she could do whatever she wanted. The way he'd said it's your story to tell when Frank Dobbs had been spreading his version of the night's events. Trust, she realized, hadn't arrived like a decision. It had arrived like a season. She hadn't chosen to trust him. She had simply at some point noticed that she already did. That recognition frightened her more than anything had in weeks. Because she knew what trust cost. She knew what it cost when it turned out to be misplaced. She was lying awake with that fear deep into a cold December night when she heard it. A sound from Thomas's side of the house that she had not heard before. She lay still for a moment, trying to identify it. Then she understood. She got up. She pulled on her coat and crossed the hall and knocked quietly on his door. Nothing. She knocked again. "Thomas?" A pause. Then rough with sleep or something else. "I'm fine." "I know you are," she said. "Open the door." A longer pause. The door opened. He was standing in the dark, fully dressed, as though he hadn't been to sleep at all, and his face had the particular tight blankness of a man who has been holding something together with nothing but will for a very long time and is running low on both. She had seen that face before. In mirrors. "What day is it?" she asked. He looked at her. Something shifted. The 14th. December 14th. She waited. "Margaret died on December 14th, he said. 7 years ago. Margaret. The name of the woman who had hung the curtains and laid the rug and set up the kitchen in a way that was meant to last. Clara didn't say she was sorry. She had already said that the night he'd told her about his wife and son, and she'd meant it, and saying it again would be the kind of thing you said when you didn't know what else to do. She knew what to do. "Come have coffee," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that contained about 15 different things, most of them too tangled to separate. Then he nodded. They sat at the kitchen table in the small hours of December 14th and drank coffee, and Clara said, "Tell me about her." Thomas looked at his cup. "You don't have to do that." "I know," she said. "Tell me about her." And he did. He talked for a long time, not the careful chosen words of a man managing what he revealed, but the less organized, more truthful words of a man who had been keeping something inside for 7 years and had finally been given a reason to let it out. He talked about how Margaret had come to Montana from Illinois and had thought the mountains were too big and the winters too long, and had stayed anyway because she had decided she loved them more than she feared them. He talked about how she had made him laugh, which he hadn't thought he was capable of until she showed him how. He talked about how his son had been 7 years old and had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness, and how the specific combination of those two things had promised to produce someone remarkable. He talked until the coffee was cold. Then he stopped and sat back and looked at Clara with an expression that was somewhere between exhausted and lighter than it had been. "Thank you," he said. "You shouldn't carry it alone," she said simply. "It's been a long time since I had someone to carry it with." Clara looked at him. "You do now," she said. The words were simple. They both understood they were not. Thomas looked at her across the kitchen table in the cold blue hour before dawn, and Clara felt the ground shift slightly under the careful architecture of what she had told herself this situation was. She had told herself it was work, safety, a practical arrangement. She had told herself she was grateful to him in the way you're grateful to a person who helps you out of a difficult situation genuinely warmly, but without the kind of weight that makes gratitude complicated. She had been lying to herself. She knew that now. What she felt was not complication. Not quite. Not yet. But it was something in that direction moving toward it the way a river moves toward the sea, not in a straight line, but inevitably. She picked up the coffee cups and went to wash them. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you." "I'm fine." "Clara." She turned. He was looking at her with the quiet attention that she had come to recognize as his version of saying something important. "Thank you," he said again, different than before. Like the first thank you had been for the coffee and the conversation, and this one was for something larger and harder to name. "Good night, Thomas," she said. She went back to her room. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her and understood that something had changed. Not in a way that was visible yet. Not in a way that either of them would name. But the way things always changed that mattered quietly in the dark while you were thinking about something else. Morning came. They did not talk about the night. But when Thomas came into the kitchen and found the coffee already made, he sat down across from her and said, "I'm going to fix the north fence line today. It'll be cold work. You don't have to come." "I know," she said. She came anyway, and he did not look surprised. 3 days later, Edna Marsh came to the ranch. Clara saw her coming from half a mile out. Edna Marsh was not a subtle woman in any dimension, and she had time to decide how she wanted to handle it. She could go find Thomas. She could be conveniently unavailable in the barn. She could meet Edna at the gate and give her the practical advantage of chosen ground. She met her at the gate. Edna arrived with a woman Clara didn't recognize younger. Sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who takes careful notes on everything she sees, for reasons she'll reveal later. "Mrs. Marsh," Clara said. Miss Bennet. Edna looked around with the assessing gaze of someone conducting an inspection. We've come to see Mr. Walker. He's working, Clara said. Is there something I can help you with? Edna's eyes cut back to her. I think perhaps what I have to say should be said to him directly. That's up to you, Clara said pleasantly. But if you've come to discuss matters relating to me, then I'm the appropriate person to talk to. Mr. Walker doesn't speak for me. Edna looked at her with an expression that was recalibrating on the fly. The younger woman, Clara noticed, was watching with considerable interest. People are talking, Edna said finally. Because Edna, when stripped of her social maneuvers, was really just a woman who needed to say the thing she came to say. About this arrangement, about what it looks like. What does it look like? Clara asked. Inappropriate, Edna said. A woman living alone with a man who, at least as the story goes, purchased her company. The story goes wrong, Clara said. I've said so before in town publicly, but I understand stories travel slower than rumors. Even still, Mrs. Marsh, Clara kept her voice calm. Even. I am a grown woman. This is a working ranch. I do work here in exchange for fair compensation, and Mr. Walker has conducted himself with more basic decency toward me than most people in this town have managed. If that is an inappropriate arrangement by Silver Creek standards, then I would suggest that Silver Creek examine its standards. The younger woman made a sound. Edna turned to look at her. The younger woman pressed her lips together in a way that might have been suppressing a smile. I came with good intentions, Edna said stiffly. I believe you, Clara said, and I appreciate them. But my life is not in need of correction. A long pause. Edna looked at the house, then back at Clara. Something moved through her expression that was not quite what Clara expected. Not offense, not doubled-down disapproval. Something that might, if she was being generous, be called respect. Reluctant and small and probably temporary, but present. You've changed, Edna said. Clara looked at her steadily. I haven't changed, she said. You just hadn't seen me clearly before. Edna opened her mouth, closed it. Then, with the precise movements of a woman making a dignified exit, she turned her horse around. Good day, Miss Bennet, she said. Good day, Mrs. Marsh. The younger woman looked at Clara as she turned to follow, and she said quietly, almost under her breath, Well done. Then she was gone too. Clara stood at the gate alone. She was shaking, not from fear this time, but from the accumulated energy of a woman who has spent years containing herself, finally slowly beginning to take up space. It was almost too much. Like standing up after being crouched for so long, your legs have forgotten how to hold the weight. That was Edna Marsh. She turned. Thomas was standing a few yards behind her, hat in his hand. Yes, she said. I heard the last part, he said. From the barn. How long were you there? Long enough, he said. She looked at him. You were not going to come out, she said. Not quite a question. I was not going to come out, he agreed, until I knew whether you wanted me to. Clara looked at him for a long moment. I didn't need you to, she said. No, he said. You didn't. But I would have been glad if you had. The words surprised her as she said them. They were true, which was why they surprised her. Clara had not gotten comfortable yet with how often the true thing also turned out to be the harder thing to say. Thomas put his hat back on. Next time, he said, I'll come out. She shook her head. No, stay in the barn, but stay close. He considered this with the gravity it deserved. I can do that, he said, and he went back to work. Clara stood at the gate a moment longer. She was thinking about what it meant that he'd been there in the barn within reach, making no move to intervene, but available if she needed him. Not absent, not hovering, just present in the right way at the right distance, trusting her to set the terms. She didn't have a word for that yet, but she was beginning to think she needed one. Christmas came with the particular bluntness of Montana winters. It didn't ask whether you were ready. It arrived and you dealt with it, and you found whatever warmth you could. Clara had not expected Thomas to do anything for Christmas. She had not expected anything for Christmas in years, and she had learned that not expecting things was the most reliable way to avoid being disappointed by them. She was wrong. She came into the kitchen on Christmas morning and found the table set, not elaborately, not with any particular flourish, but with the kind of deliberate care that said someone had thought about it. There was bread baked fresh. There were 2 plates. And in the center of the table, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of twine, was a small package with her name on it. She stared at it. "It's nothing significant," Thomas said from the stove, not turning around. "Before you make any decisions about it." "You baked bread," she said. "I do that occasionally. Not usually for breakfast." He said nothing. She sat down. She opened the package. Inside was a pair of leather gloves, well-made, soft-sized for her hands. She had been wearing an old pair with a worn-through thumb for weeks. She had not mentioned it. She looked up. Thomas was looking at her with an expression that was working hard to be neutral and mostly failing. "How did you know my size?" she asked. "Estimated," he said. "Based on the old ones you keep leaving by the door." Clara looked at the gloves in her hands. Something happened in her chest that she was not prepared for. Not the soft warmth of gratitude, which she knew how to manage. Something sharper and less manageable than that. Something that pressed against the inside of her ribs like it was looking for a way out. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out wrong. Too small. Too much in it. Thomas turned back to the stove. "Merry Christmas, Clara," he said quietly. She put the gloves on. They fit. She looked at her hands for a moment, the new leather smooth against her fingers, and she understood with sudden clarifying certainty that she was in serious trouble. Not the kind of trouble she knew how to handle. The kind that came from caring about someone. The kind she had spent the last several years building walls to keep out. And the walls, she was realizing, had been coming down piece by piece, one quiet morning at a time. One cup of coffee at a time, one. "You didn't need me there, but I'm glad you let me come at a time." And she hadn't even noticed until she was already standing on the other side of them. She looked at Thomas at the stove. He was making something. She could smell it now. Something more than bread. Something that suggested he had been up earlier than usual and had spent that time doing something he would probably describe as practical if asked. She did not ask. She sat at the table in her new gloves and watched him cook Christmas breakfast in his own kitchen in the house he had made into a home for someone he'd lost in the life he had spent 7 years trying to get through. And she thought, "I want him to be all right." Not because she owed him, not because he was owed, but because she had looked at this person over weeks of cold mornings and quiet evenings and small, honest conversations, and she had decided that he deserved to be all right. That the world would be genuinely better if Thomas Walker specifically was happy in it. That thought was so unfamiliar that it sat in the middle of her chest like a small, warm, dangerous light. She had spent so long surviving that she had forgotten what it felt like to want something for someone else. She was remembering now, and it was the most frightening and most alive she had felt in years, which meant that when the blow came, it landed harder than anything had in a long time because she had finally let herself have something worth losing. It started with a letter, not addressed to her. Addressed to Thomas. Delivered by a rider from the Silver Creek post office on a Thursday morning in early January, when the cold had settled into the kind of deep, bone-specific permanence that made everything feel like it would always be exactly this hard. Thomas read it at the kitchen table while Clara was washing up the breakfast things. She wasn't watching him. She wasn't trying to read his face. But she heard the silence change the way silence does when something has shifted inside the person sitting in it, and she turned around. He was staring at the letter with the expression of a man who has just had a wall he forgot he built fall on him. "Thomas." He looked up. "What is it?" He folded the letter carefully, set it on the table, looked at it for a moment the way you look at something you're deciding whether to pick back up. "It's from Margaret's brother," he said. "Edward Hale, out of Chicago." Clara waited. "He's coming here," Thomas said. 3 weeks. "Coming here," she said, "to the ranch." "Yes? Why?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. The quiet of a man organizing information before he speaks, not the quiet of a man hiding something. "When Margaret died," he said slowly, "Edward and I had a disagreement. About the ranch. About what I should do afterward. He thought I should sell. Come back east. He said staying here alone was... He stopped. He had words for it. Not kind ones. We haven't spoken since. And now he's coming. Now he's coming? Thomas picked up the letter and set it back down without unfolding it. He doesn't know about you. The words landed in the room carefully, like something set down on uncertain ground. Clara turned fully from the wash basin. What does that mean? She asked. He doesn't know about me. What does that change? Thomas looked at her directly. Probably nothing. Possibly everything. Edward Hale is... He chose the word deliberately. Particular. He had opinions about how things should be done when Margaret was alive. I expect he has more now. Opinions about women living on your ranch. Opinions about everything, Thomas said. But yes, that specifically. Clara dried her hands on a cloth and stood at the table across from him. Does it matter? She asked. What he thinks. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Not about this, he said. Not about you being here. I want to be clear about that. Then what are you worried about? Another pause. Longer. He's going to ask questions, Thomas said. About the arrangement. About how you came to be here. And the honest answer is the right one, and I'll give it. But honest answers about how things started. He stopped again. Frank Dobbs's version of that night has been going around for months. Edward will have heard some version of it before he arrives. Clara sat down. She understood now what Thomas was actually saying. Not that he was ashamed of her. Not that he was asking her to be different or less than she was. He was warning her. Doing her the courtesy of warning her, which was, she had come to understand entirely characteristic of who he was. He's going to come in with a story already written, she said. Yes, and we have to let him see something different. Or, Thomas said, you don't have to be here when he comes. I can arrange... Stop, Clara said. He stopped. I'm not leaving, she said. I'm not making myself invisible so that a man from Chicago can come into this house and not be uncomfortable. I have done that my entire life, and I am done with it. Thomas looked at her. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition, the expression of a man who knew this was what she would say, and was in the deepest part of himself glad she said it. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. 3 weeks, she thought. 3 weeks to be exactly who she was before a man arrived who had already decided who she was. She had faced worse. The 3 weeks passed, the way January in Montana passes, with the stubborn slowness of cold that has decided to stay, and the particular cabin fever restlessness of people who have too much to think about and limited territory in which to think it. Clara threw herself into work. She repaired equipment that could have waited until spring. She reorganized the barn with a thoroughness that made Thomas raise an eyebrow and say nothing. She baked bread on days she didn't need bread and fixed fence sections that weren't broken. Thomas watched all of this and did not comment, which was one of the things she had come to most value about him. On the 14th day, he said, "You're allowed to be nervous." She was in the middle of aggressively mending a harness that did not particularly need mending. "I'm not nervous," she said. "All right." She set the harness down. "I'm angry." "That I believe," he said. "I'm angry that a man I've never met gets to come here and look at my life and form opinions about it. I'm angry that the version of events Frank Dobbs has been spreading around is probably what Edward Hale is arriving with. I'm angry that I have to prove myself again to another person in a place where I have worked hard and conducted myself with more basic dignity than most people who've been judging me." "Yes," Thomas said simply. "And I know that anger isn't useful right now." "I didn't say that." She looked at him. "Anger is honest," he said. "You're allowed to be angry. Just..." He considered. "Don't let him see it before he's done anything worth seeing it for." Clara looked at him for a moment. "That's surprisingly tactical," she said. "I've met Edward Hale," he said dryly. She almost laughed. Almost. Edward Hale arrived on a Thursday. He was nothing like Thomas, and exactly like everything Thomas had implied without quite saying. He was a man in his middle 40s who had the kind of city-sharpened energy that looked in wide-open spaces like impatience. He dressed well. He spoke well. He carried himself with the specific confidence of a person who has spent a long time being right about things and has stopped distinguishing between confidence and certainty. He rode up to the ranch on a hired horse and dismounted with the slight awkwardness of a man who doesn't ride often, and Clara watched from the barn doorway as Thomas went out to meet him. The greeting was not warm. It was correct. The handshake of two men who have a history with each other that contains things neither of them wants to address in the first 30 seconds. "Thomas," Edward said. "Edward, good trip. Long, cold." Edward looked at the ranch with the assessing gaze of a man calculating worth. "Place looks well. It is well. Good, good." Then, without pausing, without redirecting his gaze from the property, "I heard you've taken on help." The word help landed with a particular weight. Thomas turned to look at it with him. "Clara Bennett. She's been here since November. Good worker. Runs this place better than I do in several respects." That's not quite how Frank Dobbs described the situation. "No," Thomas said. "I expect it isn't." There was a silence. Then Edward looked toward the barn and found Clara looking back at him. She had not planned to be visible in that moment. She had planned, in fact, to stay in the barn until Thomas brought Edward inside and she could be introduced on slightly less charged terms. But the conversation had carried and her feet had moved before her judgment caught up, and now she was standing in the barn doorway, being assessed by a man who had arrived with a story already decided. She did not step back. She walked forward. "Mr. Hale," she said as she reached them. "I'm Clara Bennett. Welcome to the ranch." She extended her hand. Edward looked at it for a brief notable moment before he shook it. The moment was brief enough that someone not paying attention would have missed it. Clara did not miss it. "Miss Bennett," he said. "My brother-in-law speaks well of you." "He's a fair judge," she said. Edward looked between them with an expression he was working to keep neutral. "Yes," he said. "Well, I suppose we should get inside." They got inside. What followed was 3 of the most carefully managed hours Clara had ever experienced. And she had experienced some very carefully managed hours. Supper. Conversation. Thomas and Edward moving around the territory of their shared history, like 2 people navigating a room with furniture they were both trying not to knock over. Clara contributing when spoken to, and otherwise staying present without forcing anything. Edward Hale was not a stupid man. That was the difficult thing about him. He was intelligent, and he was observant, and she could see him cataloging things the entire time. The way the kitchen ran, the way Thomas moved through his own house, the way Clara and Thomas spoke to each other with the ease of 2 people who had gotten past the stage of measuring every word. She could see him revising. That was what she hadn't expected. Not that he would be immovable, she had braced for immovable, but that he would actually look. That behind the certainty, and the Chicago correctness and the story Frank Dobbs had given him there, was a man who was still capable of adjusting what he saw to match what was in front of him. After supper, Thomas took Edward out to look at the north pasture fence. Some ranching discussion that Clara understood was also a conversational escape valve, a way to let pressure out before anyone said something that couldn't be unsaid. She washed the dishes. She was halfway through when Edward came back alone. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. She didn't turn around, but she registered the shift in the air. "Mr. Walker asked me to let you know he'll be another half hour," he said. "Thank you." A pause. "Miss Bennett." He came into the kitchen, not crowding. Giving her space she noticed in the way a man does when he's aware he's the one who owes it. "I'm going to say something that I would appreciate staying between us." Clara set a dish down and turned. Edward Hale was looking at her with an expression that had been entirely stripped of the social machinery from dinner. Just a man looking at a situation and admitting to himself what he actually saw. "Frank Dobbs told half of Silver Creek that my brother-in-law paid $20 for a woman of questionable character," he said. "That's the story I arrived with, and I want you to know." He stopped. Something moved through his face. "That story bears no resemblance to what I've seen this evening." Clara looked at him. "What have you seen this evening?" she asked. "A house that's lived in again," he said quietly. Thomas laughed twice at dinner. I have not seen him laugh in 7 years. Not once in 7 years. He looked at the table, then back at her. My sister loved him. She would not have wanted him to stay frozen like that. I've been angry at him for 7 years for not doing something about it, and it turns out the thing he did about it was $20 and a decision on a cold November night. Clara was very still. "I'm not saying I don't have questions," Edward said. "I have questions. I'll probably always have questions. but I'm not my questions, and you are not Frank Dobbs's story. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, she said. That took something to say that. Yes, he said, it did. They regarded each other with the careful respect of two people who have just arrived at an unexpected understanding. He cares about you, Edward said, not as an accusation, as a fact he had observed and was reporting accurately. Clara picked up the dish she'd set down. I know, she said. And you? She looked at him. She considered refusing to answer, which was her right, and she considered saying something safe and deflecting, which would have been the practical choice. And then she looked at the expression on Edward Hale's face and understood that he was asking because he genuinely needed to know, not for himself, but for Margaret. For the promise he had been carrying on his dead sister's behalf that the man Margaret loved would eventually be all right. Yes, she said. And me. Edward nodded once. He said nothing else. He went to the sitting room and let her finish the dishes in peace. And Clara stood at the wash basin and felt the complicated overlapping weight of what had just happened, the conversation she hadn't expected to have the answer. She hadn't expected to give out loud the word yes, sitting in the room like something she couldn't take back. Not that she wanted to. That was the thing. She did not want to take it back. Thomas came back 30 minutes later as promised, and the evening ended with a quietness that was entirely different from the charged quietness of dinner. Something that had released rather than compressed. Edward went to the spare room. Clara had moved her things to the small room off the kitchen weeks ago, without either of them formally arranging it, which was, she thought, fairly representative of how they handled most things. Thomas found her in the kitchen an hour after Edward had gone to bed. How did it go? He asked. When he came back alone. Fine, she said. He looked at her. We talked, she said. I think he came here with one story and he's leaving with a different one. What changed his mind? Clara considered. You laughed at dinner, she said. Twice. Thomas looked uncertain about what to do with that. He said he hasn't heard you laugh in 7 years, she said. The kitchen was very quiet. I haven't had much reason, Thomas said finally. I know, she said. They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen the way they had on that very first morning when the coffee was fresh and they were strangers performing the domestic ritual of breakfast while trying to figure out what the other person actually was. But they were not strangers anymore. The kitchen was the same. They were not. Thomas, she said. Yes. She looked at him. She had been building toward saying something for weeks. She had been aware of it the way you're aware of weather coming. The pressure changed the particular quality of the air. The knowledge that something is approaching, whether you're ready or not. I don't know how to do this, she said. I want to be clear about that. I don't have a good record with this. With caring about people. With letting it be real instead of something I manage from a safe distance. Thomas was perfectly still. But I am not managing it from a safe distance anymore, she said. And I think you know that. And I think you've been waiting for me to say something about it, which is exactly the kind of person you are not pushing. Just waiting. Yes, he said quietly. So I'm saying something about it. All right. I don't need anything to change, she said carefully. I'm not asking for anything. I just didn't want to keep acting like it wasn't happening when it was happening. Thomas crossed the kitchen. Not fast, not dramatic. The careful, deliberate way he moved through everything. He stopped close enough that she had to look up at him. Clara, he said, I've been very careful with you. I know, because I didn't want you to feel... He stopped. Tried again. The situation you arrived in made it important to me that you always knew you had a choice. That nothing I felt was something you were obligated to feel back. I know that too, she said. So I'm going to ask you something, he said. And I need you to answer it honestly, not kindly. Not in the way that's careful of my feelings. Honestly. She held his gaze. Ask. Do you want to stay? He said. Not because you have nowhere else. Not because it's practical. Not because I've been decent to you and you feel obligated. But because you want to be here. Because this is the life you choose. The fire popped. Clara thought about all the ways she had answered questions in her life. The careful answers. The safe answers. The answers designed to protect herself from what happened when the truth got out and turned out to be inconvenient for the person asking. Yes, she said. One word. But she meant the entire architecture of it. The mornings and the coffee and the gloves and the December 14th and the barn and the fence and all of it. Every ordinary, extraordinary day of the life she had stumbled into and found herself not wanting to leave. Thomas looked at her for a moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not a dramatic gesture, not a movie gesture. Just a man taking the hand of a woman he cared about in his own kitchen in the most ordinary way possible. She let him. They stood like that for a while. Then Clara said, "Your brother-in-law is in the next room." Thomas looked slightly pained. "Yes," he said, "and has extremely thin walls based on the construction of this house." "Also, yes." She stepped back slightly, but she didn't let go of his hand. "We'll talk more," she said. "We will," he agreed. And that was enough. For now, it was exactly enough. The morning after Edward left Silver Creek decided to have its say. Clara had learned to expect things from Silver Creek in the same way you expect certain behavior from a river. Not with surprise, but with the resigned acknowledgement that water runs downhill and people run toward drama. And there's not much you can do about either, except know where the banks are. The man who arrived was not someone she had dealt with directly before. His name was Caldwell Marsh, Edna's husband, which should have told her everything, and he came to the ranch on a Tuesday with 3 other men and the particular energy of someone who has convinced themselves they are doing something noble. Thomas was in the barn when they arrived. Clara was at the well. She saw them coming and knew immediately from the number of them and the way they rode that this was not a social call. She went to the barn door. "Thomas," she said without raising her voice. "Company." He came out. Caldwell Marsh was a heavy-set man with a gray mustache and the air of someone who had been important in Silver Creek for a long time and had confused duration with authority. He stopped his horse 10 feet from Thomas and looked down with the expression of a man delivering a verdict rather than starting a conversation. "Walker," he said. "Marsh," Thomas said. "I'll be direct," Caldwell said. "There's a feeling in town. About the situation up here. About—" His eyes moved to Clara and then back to Thomas. "The arrangement." "I see," Thomas said. "People are saying it's not right," Caldwell said. "A woman with her reputation living up here with a man alone and people in town not knowing what to make of it. There are families to consider. The example it sets." Clara felt something rise in her chest that was hot and specific and had been building for months. She took a breath and let Thomas speak first, because she had learned in the past weeks that sometimes the most powerful thing was choosing when to enter a conversation rather than entering every one. "Reputation," Thomas said. He said the word the way you say something when you're examining it for accuracy. "You mean a reputation that Frank Dobbs has been building out of a story he told badly?" "I mean, what's known about her history," Caldwell said stiffly. "What's known," Thomas said, "is whatever people decided to believe about a woman who had less power than the people talking about her. That's what's known. That's the foundation your concern is built on." Caldwell's jaw tightened. "Be that as it may." "It very much may be," Thomas said. "Walker, I'm asking you man to man." "I know what you're asking," Thomas said. "You're asking me to send her away because her presence is inconvenient for people in town. And my answer is no." "Thomas." Caldwell's voice dropped. The tone of a man trying to sound reasonable while saying an unreasonable thing. "Think about what you're doing, your name, your ranch, your standing in this community. The woman that was sold out of Grady's trading post does not belong up here, and everyone knows it." The air went very still. Clara stepped forward. Thomas saw it and did not move to stop her. He simply shifted a slight adjustment of his position that opened the space beside him instead of closing it. She stood beside him. "Mr. Marsh," she said. Her voice was clear and even, and she was very glad it did not shake. "I was not sold out of Grady's trading post. A man attempted to sell something that wasn't his to sell, and Thomas Walker stopped it. Those are not the same thing. And every time someone repeats the wrong version, they are saying something about their own willingness to look clearly at facts, not about my character." Caldwell looked at her. "Furthermore," she said, "my presence on this ranch is not your community's business. I am not a public matter. I am a person. And the people who have come up this mountain to tell Thomas Walker what to do with his own home should ask themselves what they are actually protecting, because it is not the dignity of this valley, and it is not the safety of any family. It is the comfort of not having to update an opinion they formed without evidence." Silence. The 3 men behind Caldwell had very interesting expressions on their faces. The expressions of men who had ridden up here expecting a certain kind of scene and were now in a completely different one. Caldwell looked at Thomas. Thomas looked back. My answer is no, Thomas said again. And I'd ask you and these men to write off my property. Caldwell's face went through several stages of response. Anger, recalculation, the dawning awareness that this confrontation was not going the direction he had planned. He pulled his horse around. He said without turning back, "You'll regret this, Walker." "I doubt it," Thomas said. They rode down the mountain. Clara stood next to Thomas and watched them go. Her hands, she discovered when she looked down at them, were perfectly steady. That was new. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked. "Yes," she said. She meant it. "They'll go back to town and tell it wrong," she said. "They will," he agreed. "Will it cause you real trouble? The ranch, the business?" "Probably some," he said. "Nothing that can't be managed." She looked at him. "You're not worried?" "No." "Why not?" He looked at her with that quiet, steady look that she had stopped finding foreign. "Because I know what I have up here," he said. "And I know what I'd be giving up if I let men like Caldwell Marsh decide my life, and that's not a trade I'm making." Clara looked away. Down the mountain in the direction of Silver Creek and Caldwell Marsh and Frank Dobbs, and all the versions of her story that had been told without her permission, without her presence by people who had never once thought to ask what she'd actually survived. She looked back at Thomas. "I want to go to town," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Not to chase them," she said. "Not to argue. I want to go because I've been letting this town decide what my presence means, and I'm done with that. I want to walk into Silver Creek and buy supplies and speak to people and let them see what I actually am, instead of what they've decided I am." Thomas looked at her. "When?" he asked. "Saturday," she said. "Market day, when everyone is there." He nodded. "I'll come," he said. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I'm coming." She looked at him and felt the full weight of that, not possession, not rescue, not the protective instinct of a man who thought she needed to be shielded. Just, "I'm coming. Because I want to. Because where you go, I go if you'll have me." "All right," she said. Saturday came fast. The market was exactly what she'd expected. The full population of Silver Creek's ideas about who she was, gathered in one place doing ordinary commerce, while carrying their opinions around like packages they were waiting to put down. She walked through it beside Thomas, with her head up and her hands in her new leather gloves, and she said good morning to people who hadn't spoken to her in years. And she asked the baker about his bread, and she bought flour at the general store, and she spoke to 3 people she'd never spoken to before, and not one of them was unkind. Most of them, she thought, had been waiting to see who she was when she walked through without apology. She was finding out herself. At one point, she saw Edna Marsh across the market square. Edna saw her. There was a moment brief charged the compressed weight of all the conversations they had ever had and hadn't had. Then Edna Marsh nodded. It was small. It was not warm, but it was a nod. Clara nodded back. Thomas beside her had seen it. He said nothing. But when they stopped at the edge of the market before heading back to the horses, he said quietly, "You know what's changed." "What?" she asked. "Them," he said. "Not you. They changed. Because you gave them something true to look at instead of the story that was easier to believe." Clara thought about that. "I don't know if I believe that," she said honestly. "I think some of them will go back to the old story when it's convenient." "Some of them will," he agreed, "but not all." "Not all," he said. She looked at him. "Come on," she said. "Let's go home." They rode back up the mountain, and the word home sat between them in the cold January air without either of them commenting on it, which was, Clara thought, the truest possible confirmation that it was exactly what it was. She had said it without thinking. She had meant it without trying. And the woman who had spent years learning to want nothing to ask, nothing to expect nothing, that woman was slowly, stubbornly, one cold morning at a time, becoming someone who knew exactly what she had and was not, for the first time in her life, afraid of losing it. Until the morning, she almost lost all of it in a single hour. It started the way disasters always start, quietly, without announcement, disguised as something ordinary. A man named Gerald Porter rode up to the ranch on a Wednesday morning in the second week of February. Clara was splitting wood when he arrived, which meant she saw him before Thomas did and had approximately 45 seconds to study him and understand what he was. He was a lawyer. She knew it before he introduced himself. The kind of precision in how he dressed, the particular way he held the leather satchel across his saddle, the practiced pleasantness of his expression, all of it added up to a man who spent his life delivering news that other people found difficult and had learned to make his face a comfortable place to receive it. "Mr. Walker in?" he asked her. "I'll get him," she said. She went to the barn. "Thomas," she said, keeping her voice level. "Lawyer at the gate." Thomas set down what he was doing immediately. That was the thing about him, he never had to be told twice that something mattered. He read the situation in her voice and responded to what she actually meant rather than the words she used. They walked out together. Gerald Porter introduced himself and handed Thomas an envelope with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many times. Thomas opened it. He read it. Clara watched his face and saw the moment everything changed, not dramatically, not with any outward collapse, but in the way a person's expression goes very careful when they are controlling something large. "What is it?" she asked. He looked up from the letter. "It's a legal challenge," he said. "To the property." Porter spoke then, in the measured cadence of a man who has rehearsed his explanation for difficult audiences. The situation as he laid it out was this. A man named Arthur Drummond, who had purchased several adjacent land parcels from a failed mining operation 2 years prior, was now claiming that the original sale of the Walker Ranch, the sale 12 years ago from the man named Garrett, had contained an error in the deed. A surveying error. 40 acres along the north boundary that Drummond claimed had never legally been Garrett's to sell. 40 acres that included the water source for the entire ranch. Without that water, the remaining land was worth almost nothing. Clara stood very still while Porter spoke. She was watching Thomas. Thomas was watching Porter with the expression of a man doing rapid calculations behind a composed exterior. "How long do I have?" Thomas asked. "The court date is set for 8 weeks, Porter said. "You'll want representation." "Yes," Thomas said. "Thank you for coming out." Porter tipped his hat and rode back down the mountain. Thomas stood holding the letter for a moment. Then he looked at Clara. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that Arthur Drummond did not discover this surveying error by accident. Surveying errors don't announce themselves. They have to be looked for." "Someone pointed him toward it," Clara said. "Someone with a reason to want me off this land or at minimum off balance," Thomas said. They looked at each other. "Caldwell Marsh," Clara said. Thomas didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. "Can you fight it?" she asked. "I can fight it," he said. "Whether I can win it depends on the original documents and whether the survey error is real or manufactured. Both are possible." "What do you need?" He looked at her, slightly surprised by the question, or not by the question she thought, but by the ease of it. By the way she'd said, "What do you need?" rather than, "What are you going to do?" The instinct of a person who had already decided this was shared. "I need to get to the land office in Helena," he said. "The original deed records are there, and I need a lawyer who isn't Porter because Porter works for Drummond." "How soon can you go?" 3 days, he said. "I need to arrange things here first." "I'll manage things here," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Clara, this could get complicated," he said. "Drummond has money, and Caldwell Marsh has influence, and the two of them together." "Thomas," she said. He stopped. "Go to Helena," she said. "I'll be here when you get back." Something moved through his face. He nodded, and she understood in the particular way you understand things that matter, that this was a different kind of moment than any they'd had before. Not the soft moments of December nights and Christmas morning gloves. Not the charged moments of confrontations and chosen words. This was the practical bedrock kind, the kind where you show someone not with what you feel, but with what you do when things get hard. She was showing him. He left on Friday morning. The 5 days he was gone were the longest Clara had spent alone since coming to the mountain ranch, and she used them in the most efficient way she knew how by working. She kept the animals. She kept the fires. She maintained the routine of the ranch with the focused determination of someone who understands that the way you take care of a place when no one is watching is exactly what it looks like. She thought about Caldwell Marsh and Arthur Drummond, and the particular kind of power that men like that wielded. Not the open power of confrontation which could be faced directly and answered, but the quiet power of systems and paperwork and legal language, which moved underground until it surfaced as a court date and a letter and a threat to everything a person had built. She thought about what she could do. On the second day, she made a decision. She rode to Silver Creek, not to confront anyone, not to argue or defend or perform any version of herself for an audience. She rode to Silver Creek because she had remembered something, a detail small and specific, from a conversation she'd half overheard 3 months ago in the general store between Pete Grady and a land surveyor named Hicks, who came through Silver Creek twice a year. Hicks had said something offhandedly about a survey dispute near the mountain pass, about Drummond's land purchase, and questions about the original measurements that Drummond himself had raised before the purchase, then apparently dropped. Clara had not known then why that detail mattered. She knew now. If Drummond had raised questions about the survey before buying the adjacent land, if he had known about the potential discrepancy and used it to purchase the surrounding parcels at a lower price, then waited until the time was right to deploy it against Thomas, that was not a legal dispute. That was a strategy, and a strategy could be countered if the right people knew about it. She found Pete Grady behind his counter at the trading post. "Pete," she said, "I need to ask you about something you said to Hicks, the surveyor, in November." Pete looked at her with the careful expression of a man who had been in business long enough to know that conversations about other people's conversations were always complicated. "I don't remember what I said to Hicks in November," he said. "You said Drummond had raised questions about the survey near the mountain pass before his land purchase," she said. "And then dropped them." Pete was quiet for a moment. "I might have said something like that," he said carefully. "Would you be willing to say it again?" she asked. "In a legal context, if it came to that." He looked at her for a long time. "Walker's in trouble," he said, "not a question." "Someone is trying to take his water rights," she said, "using a surveying error that Drummond apparently already knew about before he bought his land, which means the error was a weapon, not a discovery." Pete Grady set down the glass he was drying. "Hicks still has his field notes," he said slowly. "From that survey. He keeps everything, never throws a thing out. Do you know where he winters?" "Bozeman," Pete said. "He's got a sister there." Clara looked at him. "Will you write him?" she asked. Pete looked back at her. There was a long pause. The pause of a man who has spent decades staying out of things, deciding whether this was a thing to stay out of. "I'll write him today," he said. Clara let out a breath. "Thank you, Pete." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Drummond's got reach. This doesn't get simpler because you find the right papers." "I know," she said. "But it gets more honest," he said. "And sometimes that's enough." She rode back up the mountain with the particular feeling of a person who has done something useful, not resolved anything, not fixed anything, but moved one piece into a better position. It was not triumph. It was closer to the quiet satisfaction of work done carefully and well. Thomas came back on Wednesday. He came back with a lawyer named Deacon from Helena, a compact, sharp-eyed man in his 50s who spoke quickly and listened faster and with the original deed records, and with an expression that said, the 5 days had been hard ones, but productive. He walked into the kitchen and stopped when he saw Clara. She had made supper. She had not planned to make anything that could be read as symbolic, but she had made supper, and the fire was up, and the table was set. And Thomas Walker stood in his own kitchen doorway, and looked at it with an expression that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "You're all right," he said, low. "I'm all right," she said. "Sit down, both of you. I have something to tell you." She told them about Pete Grady, about Hicks and the field notes, about the conversation in November and the conclusion she had drawn from it. Deacon the lawyer leaned forward over his coffee halfway through and did not lean back. If the field notes showed Drummond knew about the discrepancy before purchase, he said when she finished, then this isn't a property dispute. It's a calculated attempt to weaponize a legal technicality he deliberately acquired. That's a different matter entirely in front of a judge. Can you use it? Clara asked. If Hicks will testify, Deacon said, or even provide a sworn statement. Yes, absolutely. He looked at Thomas. You have a remarkable woman on this ranch, he said. Thomas looked at Clara. Yes, he said. I know. She looked away before either of them could see her expression. Pete's letter to Hicks went out Thursday. The reply came back in 10 days fast enough that Clara understood Hicks had already been waiting for someone to ask the right question. Hicks remembered the survey. He remembered Drummond specifically asking about the north boundary measurement. He remembered Drummond's face when the discrepancy came up and the way the man had gone very still and then changed the subject, and he remembered thinking at the time that it was a strange reaction. He had his field notes. He would provide a statement. The 8 weeks between the letter and the court date moved in the way important time always moves, both impossibly slow and suddenly shockingly fast, so that the morning Clara rode into Silver Creek beside Thomas and Deacon, for the hearing felt both long-awaited and arrived too soon. The courthouse was a plain building on the main street, functional and without pretension. The kind of structure that understood its job was to contain what happened inside it rather than to comment on it. Half of Silver Creek, it seemed, had decided to attend. Clara saw Caldwell Marsh in the crowd outside, standing with 2 men she didn't recognize. He saw her. His jaw tightened. She nodded. She was developing a gift for the nod. Inside, Arthur Drummond sat at his table with his own lawyer, a man from Billings, expensive and well-pressed, and the easy confidence of someone who has arranged things carefully and expects them to go as arranged. That confidence, Clara noted, started eroding about 40 minutes into the hearing. Deacon was methodical. He did not rush. He laid the original deed records on the table. He called Pete Grady, who testified about the conversation with Hicks. He entered Hicks's sworn statement into the record, every field note, every measurement, every detail of the survey conversation with Drummond, including the moment Drummond had understood the discrepancy and chosen to say nothing and buy the land anyway. Drummond's lawyer objected 3 times. The judge, a weathered man named Calloway, who had been making decisions in Montana for 25 years, and had the expression of someone who had seen every variety of human maneuvering and was not impressed by any of it, overruled each objection with minimal comment. When Drummond's lawyer finished his presentation, competent Clara thought, but working with less than he'd arrived expecting to have Judge Calloway looked at the documents for a long time. Then he looked at Drummond. Mr. Drummond, he said, it is the finding of this court that the deed dispute you have raised is not the result of newly discovered information, but of information you obtained prior to your land purchase and chose to retain for later use. That is not how this court does business. He paused. The Walker deed stands as recorded. This challenge is dismissed. He closed the folder. That was it. Not a speech, not a reckoning. Just a man who had made a decision and stated it. Clara let out a breath she had been holding for 8 weeks. Thomas was very still beside her. Then he turned and looked at her, and his expression was the one she had first seen on Christmas morning when she'd opened the brown paper package, the one that was trying to be neutral and completely failing. You did that, he said quietly. Pete Grady did that, she said. And Hicks. Because you asked the right questions, he said. Because you remembered a conversation nobody else thought mattered. She looked at him. I've spent a lot of years paying attention to small things, she said. Most of the time it just kept me safe. This time it did something better. They walked out of the courthouse into cold February air, and Silver Creek had opinions, as Silver Creek always had opinions, but the opinions were different now, or at least the faces behind them, where Edna Marsh, standing near the post office, watched them walk past and said nothing. Caldwell Marsh had already gone, which told its own story. Deacon shook Thomas's hand, and Clara's in that order, and said he'd be in touch about the paperwork, and rode back toward Helena. Thomas and Clara stood on the street. "Supper," Clara said. "At the hotel. You are not cooking tonight." Thomas looked faintly startled, which she had come to enjoy the specific expression of a man not used to being taken care of, encountering it unexpectedly. "All right," he said. They went to supper. They ate at the Silver Creek Hotel's dining room, a room Clara had never set foot in, a room she had spent years believing was not for people like her. And they ate and they talked and they laughed. And Clara noticed people at the surrounding tables who watched them with expressions ranging from curiosity to something that was inching slowly towards simple acknowledgement. Not acceptance. Not yet. Maybe not ever from some of them. But acknowledgement. After supper, on the walk back to where the horses were tied, they passed the trading post. The door was closed, the windows dark. Pete Grady had gone home hours ago. Clara stopped in front of it. Thomas stopped beside her. "This is where it started," she said. "Yes," he said. "I was standing against that back wall," she said. "And I had decided that whatever happened next was just going to happen. That I didn't have the energy to fight it anymore." Thomas listened. "And then you walked in," she said. "And then I walked in," he said. She turned to look at him. "I have never asked you," she said. "What made you stop? You'd seen things like that before, things that were wrong that you didn't stop. What made that night different?" Thomas looked at the trading post door for a moment. "You looked at me," he said. She waited. "When I walked in and understood what was happening," he said, "I looked around the room and everyone was looking away. Everyone had decided it wasn't their problem. And then you looked at me." He paused. "Not asking, not begging, just looking. Like you were trying to figure out whether I was the same as the rest of them." Clara was very still. "And I decided," he said simply, "that I didn't want to be the same as the rest of them." She looked at him in the cold street in front of the trading post where everything had started, and she felt the full weight of all the months between that night and this one. The long, incremental, life-changing accumulation of mornings and conversations and shared silences, and one hand taken in a kitchen on a winter night. "You weren't," she said. "You weren't the same." He looked at her. "Neither were you," he said, "despite everything that tried to make you otherwise." She took a breath. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." "I want to stay," she said. "Permanently. Not as the hired hand. Not as—" She stopped, then made herself continue because she was done being careful when the truth was available. "I want to stay as whatever this is becoming, if that's what you want, if you're ready for that." The street was empty and cold, and Silver Creek was quiet around them. Thomas looked at her with the expression she had cataloged over months, and still didn't entirely have words for the one that was serious and warm and attentive and completely without pretense. "I have been ready," he said, "since approximately the second week of December." She stared at him. "The gloves," he said, slightly defensive. "A man doesn't notice a woman's gloves are worn through and spend 2 hours finding the right leather in town unless he has some intention." Clara looked at him. Then she laughed. Real and genuine and unguarded, the kind of laugh she had not heard come out of herself in years. And Thomas Walker, the lonely cowboy who hadn't laughed in 7 years. According to his brother-in-law, laughed with her there in the cold street in front of the building where everything had started. The sound of it rose into the Montana winter air and disappeared. But what it meant stayed. They rode home in the dark side by side, the horses knowing the mountain road well enough that neither of them had to guide carefully, which meant they could ride without looking at the ground, looking instead at the stars above the mountain pass, vast and cold and completely indifferent to the smallness of what was happening below them. Which Clara thought was exactly right. The stars did not need to care. She cared. Thomas cared. That was enough. That had always been enough. She had just needed long enough to believe it. "I need to tell you something," she said when they were halfway up the mountain. "All right," Thomas said. "Before any of this goes further," she said, There are things about where I've been and what I've done in the years before November that I haven't told you. Not because I was hiding them from you, but because I needed to be sure." She stopped. Tried again. "I needed to be sure this was real before I handed you things that could be used against me." "Clara," Thomas said. "Let me finish," she said. He let her finish. "I made choices in bad years that I'm not proud of," she said. "Nothing that hurt another person, but things that people would find ways to judge, and things that Frank Dobbs knew, pieces of which is part of why he thought he had any claim over me to begin with." She took a breath. "I want you to know before you commit to anything. I want you to know who you're actually choosing." The horses moved. The stars watched. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Clara," he said finally, "I spent 5 years doing work I'm not proud of before I bought this ranch. I've told you that. You didn't ask for details." "No," she said. "Because what mattered to you was who I was when you met me," he said. "And what matters to me is who you are now, not what surviving looked like before you got here." She was quiet. "But I'll hear it," he said. "Whatever you want to tell me, tonight or in a year or never, or some of it and not all of it. That's your choice. I'm not going anywhere based on any version of it." Clara looked at the stars. She had been waiting for a catch. She had been waiting from that first night in the trading post for the thing that was hidden. The condition. The price. There was no catch. There had never been a catch. She had just never been given a reason to believe that was possible. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said back. They rode the rest of the way up the mountain in the particular silence of two people who have just crossed a line they've been approaching for months, and have found to their mutual relief that the ground on the other side holds. The ranch came into view. The lights were not on. They had been dark the whole time, but it looked lit somehow. Warm. The particular warmth of a place that means something to the people arriving at it. Clara looked at it. "Home," she said. Not a question. Not a reminder to herself. Just the word sitting in the air as true as anything she had ever said. Thomas stopped his horse beside hers. "Home," he agreed. They went inside together, and that small, ordinary act of two people crossing a threshold at the same time carried more weight than either of them said out loud, because some things don't need saying when they're already completely true. The weeks that followed were the quietest of Clara's life. Not empty quiet. Not the quiet of absence or suppression, or the exhausted silence of someone who has run out of things to fight. Full quiet. The quiet of a life that had found its shape and settled into it the way water settles naturally, without force filling exactly the space it was meant to fill. She noticed it in small ways first. She stopped waking up in the middle of the night with her heart already moving fast, that old animal reflex of a person whose sleep has been interrupted by trouble so many times that the body starts expecting it, even when there is none. She started sleeping through to the gray pre-dawn that she had always loved when the world was still deciding what kind of day it would be. She noticed it in the mornings when Thomas came into the kitchen and the coffee was already made and neither of them commented on it, because it had stopped being a gesture and become simply the way mornings worked. She noticed it when she laughed more often now, and more easily in the unguarded way of someone who has stopped monitoring themselves for excess. She was becoming, she thought, not a different person. The same person. The person she had always been underneath the years of protecting herself from a world that had not been particularly careful with her. That person, it turned out, laughed easily, and had opinions about horses, and remembered small things about people, and was very good at knowing when to speak and when to let silence do the work. Thomas noticed. He didn't say much about it. He was not a man who narrated what he observed, but she caught it in the way he looked at her sometimes with the expression of someone watching something they had hoped for actually arrive. In March, he asked her to marry him. He did not make it a grand production, which was entirely consistent with who he was, and which she was entirely grateful for. They were at the kitchen table after supper. She was reading. He was going over the account books, which he now let her help with, because she had, within the first 2 weeks of doing so, identified 3 places where his accounting had drifted sideways, and corrected them with the polite efficiency of someone who doesn't want to make a person feel bad about arithmetic. He looked up from the books. He said, "I'd like to marry you, Clara." She looked up from her book, not surprised exactly. She had known it was coming the way you know a storm is coming. Not the specific moment, but the direction and the certainty. She looked at him. "All right," she said. He looked slightly taken aback. "All right." "Yes," she said. "Was there supposed to be more discussion?" "I thought there might be," he said. "Thomas," she said with the patience of a woman who has been waiting several months for a patient man to arrive at a question she already knew the answer to. "I told you in a cold street in front of Grady's trading post that I wanted to stay permanently as whatever this was becoming. That was the answer. I've been waiting for you to catch up." He looked at her. Then he laughed. The full, real laugh she had first heard in the Silver Creek Hotel dining room, the one that still surprised her a little every time it arrived, because it was so completely unguarded. "Fair enough," he said. "Yes," she said and went back to her book. But she was smiling at the page in a way that had nothing to do with what was written on it. They were married in May at the ranch because Clara had not wanted a church wedding, and Thomas had not pushed for one. The ceremony was performed by a circuit judge named Abrams, who came through the area twice a year and had the comfortable, no-nonsense manner of a man who had married a great many people in a great many unconventional locations and had made peace with the diversity of human arrangements. The guests were few and chosen deliberately. Pete Grady, who had come up the mountain in his Sunday clothes and appeared deeply uncomfortable in them, but had come anyway. The young, sharp-eyed woman who had been with Edna Marsh that day at the gate. Her name, Clara had since learned, was Rose Abernathy, and she had turned out to be someone worth knowing. Deacon, the lawyer from Helena, who had ridden 2 days to attend and seemed to consider it a reasonable investment. And Edward Hale. Edward had come back from Chicago in April, ostensibly on business, and had ended up staying 2 weeks, and somewhere in those 2 weeks something had shifted between him and Clara, not into warmth exactly, not into the easy comfort of old friendship, but into a kind of mutual respect that was honest enough to be worth more than warmth. He had sat at the kitchen table and talked to Clara about Margaret without being asked, which she understood was the most significant thing he knew how to give. She had listened and asked questions and not tried to fill the silences, which was, Edward had said quietly, exactly right. He stood at the back of the ceremony with his hat in his hands and his expression carefully assembled, and Clara caught him once with that assembly temporarily down, looking at Thomas with something that was unmistakably relief. The relief of a man who has been carrying a worry for 7 years and has finally been able to put it down. Judge Abrams said the words. Thomas and Clara said the words back. It did not feel to Clara like a performance or an event. It felt like the formal acknowledgement of something that had already been true for months. The paperwork catching up with the reality. When it was done, Pete Grady shook Thomas's hand and turned to Clara and said with the bluntness of a man who had watched her walk back into his trading post again and again over the past months, with her head higher each time. "You turned out well, Clara Bennett." "Walker," she said. He blinked. "Clara Walker," she said. He blinked again. Then he smiled a wide, genuine smile that she had not seen on Pete Grady's face in the entire time she'd known him, and which suggested it had been there all along, just waiting for the right occasion. "Clara Walker," he said. "Yes, you did." She laughed. And the afternoon moved on. What she had not expected, what she could not have anticipated, because she had spent too many years reading people for danger to imagine reading them. For this was what happened in Silver Creek in the months after the wedding. It happened slowly, in the way that real things happen slowly without announcement. It started with Rose Abernathy, who had come to the gate with Edna Marsh that winter day, and had said "well done" under her breath on the way out. Rose turned out to run the small lending library that operated out of the back of her husband's hardware store on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and she sent Clara a note in June asking if she would consider speaking to the women's group that met there monthly. Clara read the note twice. Then she wrote back and said yes. She went on a Tuesday in June and stood in the back of the hardware store among 12 women who ranged in age from about 20 to Edna Marsh's well-maintained 60-something. And she talked about what she knew, not her own story, not yet, but the practical things. How to read a land deed, how to manage household accounts, how to negotiate with a supplier when you knew your business and the other person assumed you didn't. She talked for 40 minutes. When she finished, nobody moved for a moment. Then a young woman in the front, maybe 22, raised her hand. "How do you know all this?" she asked. Clara looked at her. "I learned it," she said, "because I had to. And then I kept learning it, because it turned out that knowing things is one of the few resources nobody can take away from you." The young woman nodded slowly. Edna Marsh in the corner said nothing. But she came back the following month, and the month after that. Clara began to understand what was happening without quite being able to name it. She was not rehabilitating herself in Silver Creek's estimation. She was not particularly interested in their estimation, which was, she suspected, exactly why their estimation was changing. The town was encountering for the first time an unmediated version of who she actually was. Not the version Frank Dobbs had told. Not the version that shame and survival had forced her into. Not the version that arrived with its head down and its shoulders in. The version that had learned over one winter in a mountain ranch what it felt like to be exactly herself. That version, it turned out, was formidable. Not aggressively, not with anything to prove. Just formidable, in the way of a person who knows what they are worth and does not require a second opinion. It was August when Frank Dobbs came back. Clara was at the general store when he walked in, and she felt the particular physiological response that her body still produced when she encountered him. The old alarm system, reliable and automatic, sending up its flare regardless of whether she needed it anymore. She needed it less than she once had. Frank looked older than he had in November. Not dramatically 8 months is 8 months, but the kind of older that comes from something internal. Like a person who has been carrying something uncomfortable, and it's starting to show. He saw her. He stopped. They stood in the general store 10 feet apart, the space between them containing everything that had happened in the past 8 months, the trading post and the $20 and the mountain ranch and the court hearing and the wedding and all of it. Every piece of it fitting together into the complicated shape of a life that had changed. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "Frank," she said. He turned his hat in his hands. The gesture of a man who has something to say and hasn't decided how to say it. "I heard about the Drummond business," he said. "What you did, finding the survey notes. It needed doing," she said. "Yes," he said. He stopped, started again. "I said things, after that night at Grady's, about you and about Walker, and about what happened. I said things that weren't true, and I said them to people who believed me." He was looking at his hat rather than at her. "I said them because if people believed a certain story, they didn't look too hard at what I'd done." The general store was very quiet. "I know that," Clara said. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said quickly. "I don't expect that. I just wanted you to know I'm aware of what I did, that I know the story I told was the wrong one." Clara looked at him for a long time. She thought about all the places Frank Dobbs occupied in the story of her life. Not the villain exactly, not a man who had set out specifically to destroy her, but something more ordinary, and in some ways worse. A man who had been careless with another person, because carelessness was easier than care, and who had covered that carelessness with a story because stories were easier than accountability. She had known a lot of men like that. She was standing here in this store, a married woman with a life she had built, and a reputation that no longer required defending because one man had been different. "Frank," she said. He looked up. "I don't forgive you," she said. "I'm not there yet. Maybe I will be eventually. But I also don't need you to be the villain in my life anymore. What happened, happened. What I have now is mine, and neither of those things requires anything from you." He nodded. His jaw was working. "All right," he said. He put his hat on. He walked out. Clara stood in the general store and breathed. The woman behind the counter, a young woman named Della, who had started working there in the spring, and who had, Clara suspected, heard every word, was looking at her with an expression of undisguised admiration. Clara picked up the flower she'd come for. "Good morning, Della," she said. "Morning, Mrs. Walker," Della said. Clara walked out into the August sun. She stood on the street for a moment. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel the specific satisfaction of an account settled. She felt, if anything, lighter, the way you feel when you put down something you didn't realize you were still carrying. She had not realized until Frank Dobbs walked out of that store that some small part of her had still been waiting for him to matter to her story. Waiting for the resolution that would come from him, the apology, the acknowledgement, the moment where he became in some way responsible for making things right. He was not responsible. He never had been. Her story did not depend on him. It never had. She rode back up the mountain with that understanding sitting in her chest, like something finally set into its proper place. And she was still riding when she saw Thomas at the north fence line working on a post that had been giving trouble all summer. And he looked up when he heard the horse and raised a hand, and she raised a hand back. That was all. Just two people who knew each other, recognizing each other across a field. She felt the full weight of it. She let herself feel the full weight of it. September brought the first cold snap of early fall, and with it something Clara had not expected, a visitor she had not seen in almost a decade. Her sister, Catherine Bennett. Still. Bennett never married, which Clara learned from the letter that arrived 3 days before Catherine herself arrived, because Catherine was the kind of woman who sent letters ahead of herself to make sure she was still welcome before she showed up. The letter was 2 pages. It said in Catherine's particular careful handwriting that she had heard from a mutual acquaintance that Clara was alive and well and living in Montana, and that she had spent a long time deciding whether to write, and had decided that the risk of rejection was less than the weight of not knowing. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table with Thomas watching her from across it. "My sister," she said when she finished. Thomas waited. "We haven't spoken in 9 years," she said. "There was a disagreement about—" She stopped. "About choices I made. After my daughter's father left. Things I did to survive." Catherine had opinions. "And now she's coming," Thomas said. "She's asking if she can come," Clara said. "That's different. What are you going to say?" Clara looked at the letter. She thought about 9 years. About the particular shape of a family estrangement. How it feels at first like a wound, and then like a scar, and then like a background fact of your life that you stop expecting to change. She thought about the woman she had been when the estrangement happened, and the woman she was now. "Yes," she said. She wrote back that afternoon. Catherine arrived on a Thursday morning, looking like someone who had been rehearsing what to say for the entire journey, and had forgotten it all in the last mile. She was 4 years younger than Clara, with their mother's eyes and their father's stubborn jaw, and the particular nervousness of a person who has done something they aren't sure will be received well. She dismounted in the yard and looked at Clara and said, "You look well." "I am well," Clara said. A pause. "Thomas Walker," Thomas said from beside Clara, extending his hand with the timing of a man who understands when to make things easier. "Welcome to the ranch." Catherine shook his hand and looked at him, and then looked at Clara with an expression that said she had been told things and was now reconciling them with what she actually saw. "She talked about you in the letter," Catherine told Thomas. "More than she probably meant to." "Catherine," Clara said. "It's a compliment," Catherine said. Thomas excused himself to tend to the horses with the diplomatic efficiency of a man who could read a room. The sisters stood in the yard. "I'm sorry," Catherine said. "I should say that first. I said things that were I wasn't kind, and I was wrong. Not wrong to have concerns, maybe, but wrong to—" She stopped. "I was wrong to say them the way I said them, and then too proud to take them back." Clara looked at her sister. She looked at the 9 years on Catherine's face and recognized the specific fatigue of carrying an estrangement. The way it doesn't get lighter over time, the way you hope it will, but more familiar, which is different, which is worse. "I was wrong too," Clara said. "In some of what I did. Not all of it, but some." Catherine's breath came out. "Can we start from here?" she said. Clara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said, "we start from here." They went inside. They talked for 3 days. Not all of it was easy. Reconciliation between people who have been apart for 9 years and who parted in anger is not a simple linear process. It is more like rebuilding a structure where some of the old material can be reused and some has to be replaced, and you have to be honest about which is which. They were honest. That was the thing. Clara had gotten so accustomed that winter on the mountain to the terrifying luxury of honesty, to saying the true thing, instead of the safe thing, that she had lost the habit of pretending. And Catherine, faced with a sister who refused to pretend, found herself also refusing. And the conversations they had in those 3 days were the most honest they had had in their entire lives, including the conversation about their daughter. About Clara's daughter, who Catherine had never met, who had died at 2 years old, who Clara had never told Catherine about because they had already been estranged by then, and she had not been able to bear the thought of hearing Catherine's response. She told her now. Catherine listened. When Clara finished, Catherine put her hand over Clara's and did not try to find words for it, which was the right thing, which Clara had not expected from her, and which moved her more than words would have. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," Catherine said finally. "So am I," Clara said. Thomas, who was learning the art of being in the right place at the right time, appeared in the kitchen doorway, approximately 30 seconds later, with coffee and the expression of a man who was absolutely not going to comment on anything he may or may not have overheard from the adjacent room. He set the coffee down. He went back out. Clara looked at Catherine. Catherine looked at the direction Thomas had gone. "He's a good man," Catherine said. "Yes," Clara said. "How did you know?" Clara thought about it. "He told me I could leave," she said. "The first night. He said you can do whatever you want. I'm not asking anything back. And I thought either this man is extraordinary or he's the best liar I've ever encountered." She paused. "Took me about 3 weeks to determine which." Catherine smiled. A real smile. The one Clara remembered from before everything went sideways. The one that had always made their mother say Catherine had her grandmother's smile, which was meant as a compliment so specific to a grandmother Clara had never met, that she had never been sure what to do with it. "I'm glad you found him," Catherine said. "So am I," Clara said. Catherine stayed 2 weeks. She and Thomas found to Clara's quiet delight a kind of comfortable mutual respect that did not need to be managed or encouraged. Thomas treated her like a person worth talking to, which was both his nature and the thing that always won people over eventually. And Catherine treated him like a man who had earned his place, rather than one who was on probation, which was more generous than Clara had expected. When Catherine left, she hugged Clara at the gate the first time they had touched in 9 years, and said into her shoulder, "You're happy." "Yes," Clara said. "I can't tell you what that means to me," Catherine said. "After everything. Just that you're happy." Clara held her sister. "Come back," she said. "Don't wait 9 years." "I won't," Catherine said. She rode down the mountain. Clara watched her go. Thomas stood beside her. "Good?" he asked. "Good," she said. They stood there a moment longer watching the road until it was empty again. Then Clara turned and looked at the ranch. The barn, the fence line, the house with its curtains that had belonged to a woman named Margaret, and that Clara had never taken down because they were part of the life Thomas had built, and she had inherited not to replace, but to continue. She had come to understand that about love over the course of that year. It was not replacement. It was continuation. You did not love someone into erasing what came before. You loved them into building what came next. Margaret had built a home. Clara was building a life in it. Both things were true. Both things were right. The first snow of the season came in October, earlier than usual, and Silver Creek responded the way frontier towns responded to early snow, with the resigned practicality of people who had always known the winter was coming and had simply hoped to have a little more time. Clara and Thomas were as ready as they had ever been. The ranch was in the best shape it had been in years. The accounts were solid, more solid than they had been before Clara had gotten her hands on them, which Thomas acknowledged with the straightforward honesty of a man who had no ego about his own limitations. The animals were well. The fences were sound. The woodpile was a cathedral of preparedness. And on the first real snow morning, when the world outside was white and muffled, and the fire was up and the coffee was made, they sat at the kitchen table, and Clara looked at Thomas and thought, "This is it." Not the thought of a woman trying to convince herself. Not the thought of a woman who had gotten what she wanted and was checking to make sure it was real. The thought of a woman who had been so far inside surviving for so long that thriving felt foreign and was now for the first time standing completely inside a life she had chosen and finding it exactly what she had not known she was looking for. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked. She looked at him. "That a year ago, I was standing in the cold outside a trading post, deciding whether to follow a stranger up a mountain," she said. "And now I'm sitting in my own kitchen in the first snow of the year, and I don't have a single thing I'm afraid of." Thomas considered this. "Not a single thing," he said. "Within reason," she said. He smiled. She looked at him and felt the full truth of the year laid out behind her, like a road she had walked each difficult mile of it, each moment where it could have gone wrong, each choice that had required something from her she wasn't sure she had. She had had it. She'd had it the whole time. She had just needed one person to be different. One person to walk into a room full of people looking away and decide to look directly, and then she had done the rest herself. That was what the $20 actually was. Not rescue, not purchase, not charity. It was the price of one moment of someone deciding that another person mattered enough to stop and look clearly. Everything else, the months of work, the confrontations, the court hearing, the honest conversations, the returned sister, the life that had been built piece by deliberate piece in a mountain ranch above Silver Creek, Montana. All of that had come from within her. It had always been there. She had always been worth finding. She had just finally found herself. Thomas reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She looked at their hands. Then she looked up at him. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the fire kept burning. And Clara Walker, who had once stood against a wall in a trading post, with nothing but her own fierce enduring will, sat in the home she had made and understood, with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who had earned every word of it, that some lives don't begin until the moment someone refuses to look away. And that the moment Thomas Walker slammed $20 on a table was not the price of a person. It was the first sentence of the rest of her life.